welcome to Dreamland, the RetroBlasting podcast. My name is Melinda.
And I'm Aaron.
And we're just jumping right in today so that we can get right to the topics, which are going to be kind of surprises for each other because we're doing one of those cool splitsy 50-50 episodes where, like, I pick a topic and tell Aaron about it, and then he picks a topic and tells me about it, and then the other person just kind of sits there amazed and, like, learns something new along with you, the listener. I don't think I need to explain that, but I did.
You so did.
You're welcome.
That's good. I have questions. So to follow up with the first thing that you said, the part where we podcast, what was...
It's only a theoretical podcast.
So normally when we get together and do this, as you pointed out, shortly after lunch, I'm the one who usually goes first.
That's right.
So do you want to start things out this time?
No, I say stick to tradition. Go ahead.
Stick to tradition and go ahead?
Yeah.
All right. So a week ago in space-time, we all got together and did a live stream, and several people who were on the live stream commented or asked questions about Chernobyl. Mm-hmm. The HBO special. And I was very careful about how I answered that question because I was kind of secretly thinking that for our next show, I wanted to go back and revisit the topic of Chernobyl because we did a podcast a while back that was a mixtape. It was about Chernobyl and the PMRC. Mm-hmm. And it was a lot of fun. But at that time, I didn't even know they were planning on making a miniseries about Chernobyl. So kind of what I thought I would do is I would finish the series because I was only partway through it at the time. So like I said, I didn't know that they were going to do, I think, an excellent TV documentary style show about Chernobyl when we recorded that last podcast. And I had some sort of I would just sort of a sideline interest in Chernobyl because, like a lot of things that had to do with the Cold War era, there was a lot of mystery. It was almost, I don't mean to offend anyone who grew up in the Soviet Union during this time, but there's this air of like Mordor around it. There was just like these big mountains and there were like these thunderheads over it and there be dragons over there. Sort of menace that came from that direction. So obviously as a kid, I became very sensitive to it and interested in everything I could find out as I get older. And a lot of times you find out that there was just a lot of mundane, everyday stuff going on. It was just all propaganda. There was so much stuff in the news that was designed to make you feel a way or whatever. Well, it turns out though that, with a topic like Chernobyl, there is a great deal of stuff that we are still learning. There's a great deal of stuff that we're still learning about what happened. So for those of you who lived under a rock, there is a new HBO...
a rock, not the country Iraq.
For those of you who have spent the last couple of weeks under a rock, you know that there was a very controversial, beloved, some loved it, some hated it, season-ending episode of a show called Game of Thrones. And,
that show.
Yeah. And
I kind of remember that show.
You kind of do? I know that you weren't as big of a fan of Game of Thrones.
I just didn't watch it.
Yeah. And that's usually a sign of not a fan.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a fan. But
if that's too strong of a statement, I'll retract it.
have a problem with anyone who did watch it, though.
Okay. That makes perfect sense. It was one of those things that I got into when it first started. But like when I tried to read the books, I sort of just kind of went, oh, yeah, I kind of get this, and moved on and just didn't go back to that show. But after that show ended, there was like this gulf, this void, this quiet of what's next.
What's going to happen to HBO? Are they going to die?
Yeah, they're not. That wasn't what I was saying. Oh. There was the question.
Oh, sorry. Did I step on your punchline?
No.
Oh.
I just forgot joy for a moment. I'm better now.
Good.
So in this vacuum of the show ending, everybody was kind of wondering what was going to happen next. And I'm an avid reader of things like Reddit and places like that, just to sort of keep a pulse on what everybody's talking about. And I started seeing all these little references to Chernobyl and these little meme quote type things coming up. And so I was like, this is too directly aimed at something I'm interested in. And I guess a little bit hipstery to the point where I was like, oh, I don't know, it's popular. I don't know if I'm going to check that out. And then one day I sat down and started watching it. And I had a lot of thoughts and feelings. So have you watched any of the Chernobyl?
I have not. Not because I didn't want to, but just because I haven't had the time. I did see it on there and thought, wow, that looks really cool.
It's got a really interesting, at least presentation of the way the trailers are and the visuals of it. It's very murky. It's very dark. And through my reading about it after the fact, I found that it's kind of viewed as a horror TV show.
Well, yeah, a lot of the folks on a lot of the, I say murder boards, but like all the true crime like groups that I'm in online, they all talk about it too, because it's sort of like an overlap Venn diagram-y thing of people who are into true crime also kind of into the whole Chernobyl thing, a lot of them.
I'm starting to think it might be an everybody thing.
Yeah. And so, but they were talking about it, and because of some of the things they said sort of vaguely in passing about it, having to do with like showing something about animal something, I was like, I don't know if I want to watch that. So you and I had a conversation about that, and you kind of, spoiler alert, kind of told me what that was all about, just so that I could make the decision of whether I wanted to watch it or not or whatever, which was cool. Yeah, I think I will watch it, but it's, I've been avoiding it because I'm like, I don't know if I want to see that part.
Yeah, the part that going into this, I want to say I'm going to try very hard, even though this is a historical topic. The writer of it, Craig Mazin, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, did take a lot of literary license with how he presented several of the events in it, which I think added a lot to the story, especially if you compare it to, like, he's very open and honest about where he made some of these decisions. And so if you pay attention to some of the other stories he's been a part of or interviews, he very clearly lays out where and why he made some editorial changes. I do think it's worth going into and seeing it as it unfolds, even if you feel like you know a lot about the story, because the truth is there's a whole lot more to it that just has still taken a long time to be declassified or for people to even talk about. And some of it, I think, has been very widely known, maybe in Ukraine and maybe other places, Lithuania, other places that were close to this. And some of it, I think, is just, I don't know, when I think back after our last discussion, there was a made-for-TV movie about Chernobyl that I saw as a child. And it stands out in my head because they used the same visual effects for actually how they depicted the cooling rods or the control rods being pushed back into the reactor were the same shots that were in Total Recall when they melted all of the ice to create oxygen on Mars like one does.
Wow.
So I remember I saw that TV show, and then when I was a little older, I saw Total Recall and was like, hey, these are the exact same shots of this reactor being used. And I couldn't figure out, did they just sort of like for Total Recall just reuse B-roll that they thought nobody saw this Chernobyl thing? But
maybe.
Also, it's kind of haunting because I generally remember when this happened in the 80s because it's sort of, even though I was very young, it still actually kind of scared me as a kid. As one of my first encounters with there are forces in the world that are large enough to reach out and wipe a whole swath of people right off the chessboard. And so for a while, I would always identify the little radioactive symbols on like the maps to figure out where the nuke plants were, because I just couldn't stop being fixated on this idea. While at the same time, I've always been very optimistic about nuclear power for a lot of reasons. Mainly one of them being the fact that this is not like, I don't know, I'm not trying to get too far into environmental issues and things like that. But
how dare you even try to go near that?
With the exception of when things like happen, like the reactor explodes, you can generally sequester all of the pollution produced by a nuclear reactor and store it somewhere, as opposed to burning something and it blows off in the wind and you never can capture all of the poisons that are released by that generation process. Now I'm going to bore everybody by using words like generation process.
It's not boring.
That's true. Thank you.
I mean, you told me that on the way to lunch when you were telling me about geology or something. You told me it wasn't boring. Yeah,
I don't think I really get to make that decision for other people, though. So I did. I sat down and started going through this, and I had a couple of thoughts on it. I know that we're doing half an episode, so I don't want to take up the whole thing going through it. So like I said, the writer had to take kind of a literary approach to how he displayed this show. And there were a couple of very noteworthy episodes. This is a very, very big story to tell. And there are so many lives that were affected by it. And there were so many people who had either a positive or a negative effect on what happened in Chernobyl that there was no way to take a fairly tight cast in 5 episodes to tell everything that you could possibly tell. So there were occasions where, and this is where I think I'm kind of struggling now to try to really get my head around how to talk about it without spoiling a lot of things. But there are 3 main cast members, and you'll probably recognize most of them. There's Stellan Skarsgård, who plays Boris Sherbina, who was a kind of a big Soviet apparatchik who was over the energy industry. And you'll recognize this actor. He was in Thor. He's been in a lot of movies. He's a Swedish actor, and he sort of melts into each role he has. The thing that sticks out to me is him in him and Iron Man duking it out on top of the tower, and he's just standing there in his underwear, like he was wearing his tiny whities. But he played a scientist in that. Well, in this, he plays a political figure in the Soviet sort of regime. And he's, got kind of a mail-off degree about how nuclear reactors work, but he's still trying to figure out how, he's been tasked by Gorbachev to go out and just fix whatever's happening in Chernobyl. So the other actor that you might recognize is Jared Harris, who plays Valery Legasov, who is this guy who was in charge of the sort of a nuclear, I wouldn't say like industry, it was more of an academic group that was in control of how nuclear reactors were produced and how they were managed and governed, but it was kind of an academic stronghold, if you will, where a lot of these folks got together and figured out exactly how to handle day-to-day operations of their large nuclear industry. And he gets kind of called out of his bed because he's in charge of this group, and he's got to go also help answer the questions that Boris Sherbina can't answer. So he finds himself in meetings with Gorbachev and things like that, kind of trying to figure out when to keep his mouth shut and when to say what he really needs to say. So the third actress that you see up here in sort of the top 3 of their featured actors on the HBO site for this television miniseries is an actress by the name of Emily Watson, who I knew from Equilibrium, who worked with, was with Christian Bale and was one of the sort of revolutionary folks who were trying to get him to wake up and realize that he needed to feel emotions. It's kind of a B action movie that, you either like it or you hate it. But for some reason, she does stand out as somebody who I've seen a lot in different sort of British and American productions, which now that I've said those 3 is there's something about this Russian story that they're telling that sort of seems like it's going to be a documentary, but turns out that it's actually kind of I
actually didn't know until you started talking that it wasn't a documentary.
And I was kind of ambivalent going in, thinking that it could be a documentary or it could be, and it does that. It kind of sneaks up on you.
Honestly, that makes me feel better about the whole dog thing.
Yeah.
Because there's like this whole dog thing that happens in the movie. I won't spoiler it, but I mean, if you're sensitive to violent animal type stuff, which I am, that's why I was avoiding it. But I was mostly avoiding it because I thought it was like actual footage of that happening. And I was like,
that makes perfect sense.
Oh, I don't want to see that.
And I think that's why it is possible to tolerate some of these difficult moments in the shows, because there are a few things that are legitimately like the phone call. So in the first episode, so there's not a lot of spoilering going on, they call the fire department because they just think that the Chernobyl plant's on fire, and they have the actual phone call recorded that they play at that part of the thing. So you can actually hear the people, speaking in Russian, saying that there's a fire, and I think there's subtitles or something. But one of the things that jumps at you really fast about this, if you've already seen it, you've already wondered why, is that almost everybody in this movie is British.
That was literally the next question that I was going to ask is, and this is something that I always think whenever I see anything that's set in Russia or anything like that, why can we not have Russian actors who are native Russian speakers to be in anything? I know they exist. I've seen movies made in Russia with Russian actors because it's Russian. So it always wigs me out to see like British people or hell American people with either a really bad fake Russian accent and I am certainly not the person to be able to gauge how bad it is, but I can tell some of them are like really like, Boris and Natasha. Like,
it's funny that you say that because I did go and one of our fans wrote in our email and said, did you realize they have a set of podcasts for every episode in this? And I went and checked it out, and it's the writer and Siegel from NPR sitting across from each other.
Oh, really?
Just talking about making this TV show. So if this is a rabbit hole you go down, I highly recommend. They've got 45 minutes per, episode of 5 episodes where they just talk about why this happened, why that happened, what got cut, and what was left in. And one of the first things that Siegel asks him is, and I wanted to ask him, and I think everybody I've talked to about the show wants to know, why British? Why is everybody British? It sounds like a bunch of English people are in the middle, just outside of Kiev running a nuclear power plant. And it made a weird kind of sense because I was kind of put off by it at first. And I thought, is this just sort of like I, Claudius, or like so many other British, productions where everybody's British and you just sort of go with it and it's fine. And he said 2 things that really stood out to me. One of them was that he didn't want to go Boris and Natasha. He's saying that everybody has heard a bad Russian accent. And when they started to shoot, they even made some attempts to do a little bit of a Russian accent. And he said that everybody started acting the accent and not the character.
But if you actually were Russian and you weren't putting on an accent, then you wouldn't be doing that.
Yeah. And I think there was a balance between trying to find a specific, because if you do watch this and then you look at still photographs of the people in the who were involved in this event, they're eerily close in
You mean
appearance.
the way they look?
Yeah, in the way they look in appearance. So this, once again, literary license, this is the cautionary tale for this whole thing, is that you're going to watch this whole series and you're going to have a better understanding of why this happened and how this happened and all of the things that led up to it. But what you will not see is an exact replica of what happened.
Right.
There's been a lot of...
that's a given.
It's
sure.
almost like a play has been produced for television. And so there's a lot of decisions that were made for aesthetics. If you look around, I got a real sense watching it that it looked identical to the photographs that I was used to looking at of what Pripyat, which is the town outside of Chernobyl, and other places look like. And that was because they actually filmed in Ukraine and Lithuania. So there's a sense of why didn't they hire Russian, but they still went into Russia and they were a boon to the economy and other things in those areas. So the first thing he said is that, he, for whatever reason, he hired the British actor or actress for the part. He didn't want them to imitate a Soviet or a Russian accent because the people were getting a little caricature and it was running away. So it was like one day of it, he said, and then they were done. Or just like, let's not do that again. The other thing that made a weird kind of sense to me, and this is a question that I asked myself right after this, is are they trying to say something to us as society right now about what we thought the Soviet Union was like in the 80s and the society that we live in now? Are they that different? Are there things that we could see that make parallels? And this is where I'm kind of dangerous to getting into some political topics, but I feel like that's an important part of this show is, wow, look at how wildly this went wrong. Doesn't seem that different than some things that we see right now, where people just sort of stick to their guns and make decisions based on
They just sort of dig in.
Yeah, and people believe things that aren't true, and they just, all kinds of stuff goes on with that. And this lends to the theory that I have that it is specifically directed at the West, England, the U.S., all this sort of free world, to take a good hard look at ourselves and at the way things were operating over there, is because the director said something about like, hey, if you were a Russian-speaking person in the Soviet Union and you were interacting with someone in the Ukraine, it wouldn't sound that different to you. So He makes the comment that he didn't hire any Americans because that would just sound silly to have Americans running a nuclear plant.
So real quick, is he British?
He does not sound British.
Okay.
He sounds American.
Okay.
And then it occurred to me in the moment that if I were a Russian-speaking person listening to someone speak Russian but was from the Ukraine, they would have a slightly different accent, similar to...
I would agree with that for sure.
If
you
I
just
were
can't hear it if you're an American.
Right. It just all sounds Soviet. But even more so, hearing someone speak with a British accent as an American might be eerily close to being someone from Moscow listening to someone from Ukraine. Sort
of the bias of, or if you want to call it bias, it's not ethnocentrism, but it's sort of just your own self. Like to me, I can sit here and go, well, people from the Ukraine and people from Russia kind of all sound very alike to me. And I just call all of that Russian. I don't really, but like I could see how somebody from America would do that. But like we think that British people and Australian people and South African people and New Zealanders and Americans like all sound very, very different, even though we're all speaking English, but they may not sound different to a Russian. And I mean, hell, even within the United States, we think we have accents that we can identify. I even think there are subsets of Southern accents that are identifiable, Texan versus Mississippi versus Louisiana versus Georgia.
Just having lived in Alabama and Georgia, I can tell you, yes, there's some very subtle but real differences.
So it's just what your ear is tuned to that you can
Which is
hear.
why I think this show was geared towards the West that way, because, you know, watching it, I sort of forgot that they weren't speaking Russian. I sort of forgot that they didn't have Russian accents.
But is it because they're speaking the language that you know? And I mean,
it was closer to what it would be like if I was a Russian listening to a Ukrainian person speak Russian. Like the only barrier was that the accent's a little different and they have different mannerisms. We're just going to ease you in
on the shallow end of the pool so that you don't feel so distant from the characters. Because if they're speaking with heavy, thick Russian accents, you might not identify as much with them.
Yeah, I felt like I did identify. And there was still a lot of alienness to the performance. So, you know, if that accent or the speaking the language and not having subtitles thing kind of throws you off or irritates you, they did spend an uncanny amount of time figuring out how a Russian person would act, you know, how their mannerisms, what they would eat, the things they would say to each other, the way they would look at each other. There was still such a culture shock watching these actors in what looked to me exactly like Pripyat, dealing with somebody who was clearly from the KGB. And so you have these alien concepts sort of creeping in, and all of a sudden the language problem isn't an issue. It still seems like, wow, that's really creepy. And I don't know what I'd do if I were in that situation. So that was one of the interesting spots where he took a lot of license with how it was produced. If you're looking for other things to that effect, I would say the main reason they didn't shoot directly on location was because everything looked 30 years older. So they actually present everything in the pristine condition that the Russians who worked there, the Soviets who worked there would have seen. Why I think that's really cool is because in the West, we grew up thinking of the Soviet Union as one thing, but this place, Pripyat, where the nuclear reactor was sort of a utopian version of the ideals of Lenin at the time. So it was sort of like this place everyone wanted to work, like a worker's paradise, where they had pools, they had lots of shops with things in it that the other people couldn't buy. They really were kind of living the good life in this town. And of course, what we see now when we see pictures of the places, it's overgrown and abandoned and kind of scary. And then the biggest one, I think, in the whole series is that Emily Watson's character is actually not a real person from the history of the story, which threw me off. I did not realize that watching the show. But basically her character is this scientist from a neighboring institute who starts to realize that something horrible's happened in Chernobyl. And she sort of edges her way in, like forces her way into the discussions and actually saves the day on several occasions because she does, she works things out and realizes they haven't taken this into account. And now that horrible thing's going to happen. And there were some really neat things that happened with this character. For one, she's a woman in the 80s. And she's taken very seriously when she gets into the room. So it was this interesting look at how in the Soviet world, there was a lot of respect paid towards women when they achieved these stations in life, at least from other scientists. So when she bursts into a room and says, "You're going to kill half of Europe if you do this," I almost expected sort of the old 50s sort of like, "Oh, you've lost your mind now. Go get out of here." See?
I think you need to go lie down.
Yeah. Oh, settle down. No, it was very like, I hadn't considered that, and everybody took a step back and sort of reorganized how they were going to approach the problem. And then, to find out that she's actually there representing an army of other scientists who were backing up the main character as he worked through this problem. And in order to make the show work in 5 episodes, they concentrated a lot of those different scientist stories, men and women, into one role. So you see her in the show sort of having these powers of like fast travel, like you saw in Game of Thrones, where people just suddenly appeared in different cities and places, and there didn't seem to be the right amount of time in between. A lot of that's because she's sort of playing the part of a lot of different people who are doing all of this 18 montage work of going around and figuring out why this reactor, which should have been impossible for it to explode, exploded.
That's a really funny idea. Like every scene, even if it's like on the other side of the earth, like she just walks in, she just walks in and what's going on over here?
Yeah, zoop, zoop. It sort of feels like that sometimes. You don't really get a clear sense of time passing, but all of a sudden she's in Moscow.
Maybe she has prescience.
Maybe she is the sleeper who has awakened. Father! So, yeah, I mean, there's so much about this show to talk about. I'm sure you can tell that I'm having a hard time finding the right path through it. But that's because I have become very excited to have a reason to dig back into a topic that I've always found very fascinating. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it really all boils down to the fact that there was a lot of ego.
That's not surprising at all.
But, you know, in a relatively few amount of people, you know, small amount of people. So you have the man who runs the control room, who's looking for promotion. You have his boss who's looking for promotion. It all boils down to the fact that when they built this reactor, they were supposed to have completed a safety test. A simple safety test that just says, hey, if the West blows up our power supply and we no longer have power coming into a nuclear plant, which is a whole other story that a nuclear plant needs power, then how will we pump water through the reactor to cool it? And they had this idea, well, we could take the momentum that's already in the turbines, let that momentum spin down generating electricity and use that to pump the coolant water back in while we start the diesel generators. So all they really needed to do before they brought the reactor fully online was test this. Well, at the time Mayday was coming up, they wanted to get their promotions. They wanted to get their bonuses. So they went ahead and signed off on the reactor, having not completed the safety test.
No one would ever do that.
I think it happens. That's the thing where I look around and I go, I see that happen on a much smaller scale all the time where people sort of, they have to get fuzzy to get the job done. And it's not always a bad thing to have to make these calls. But in this case, you're dealing with a nuclear reactor, the largest nuclear reactor that had been built in the Soviet Union at the time, and the pride of, as they say in the show, of a country that is terrified to lose face in front of the rest of the world. Like their whole job is to not embarrass themselves most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, you can read about the guys, and men and women, who manned the missile silos here in the United States after the end, or I guess after World War II, but during the Cold War and then after the Cold War even, people still had to be in those missile silos. And it's just this like really drudge work type of job, but they were still supposed to be running tests and things like that. And they really weren't, but they were signing off on things just because there was a lot of, in that case, it was more, I just don't care because I'm so bummed out that this is my job and it's very depressing and I'm whatever. But I mean, yeah, I think people get complacent around very scary things because they just get used to it.
Yeah. And you know, I picked up a book. The writer, the reason where I found this book is the writer said that this guy wrote a book, which I'll mention in a moment. And he said, I wish this book had existed when I started writing this show. So I immediately went out and found it on Audible and started listening to it. And it gives you a lot more backstory. I'll just go ahead and say the name of the book. It's called Midnight in Chernobyl by Agan Higginbotham. It gives you a much more in-depth look at each of the people, their childhoods, their upbringings. These are all kind of salt of the earth, fairly decent people for the most part, right? With good educations and families and morals, and they take care of their pets and they buy food for for the most part, they just sound like the rest of us. Mm-hmm. But then they find themselves in this sort of vice of the Soviet Union and the fact that there is a whole lot of pressure to meet your deadlines and make us look good and get this big power plant going. And so there were some poisons coming in the form of, yeah, we don't really have the materials you need to build this plant, so just use whatever you can get, but then lie about it on paper so everybody thinks it's made out of the right stuff. So there was already this sort of technology creep coming in where everything looked like it should be fine, but it was not built quite to spec. So this test not having been done haunted the main characters for most of their lives that they've been running this plant. And so the whole reason Chernobyl happened was they decided they were going to ram this test through. And then there were, compounding errors, which they run through in the final episode. They actually walk you through moment by moment, step by step, exactly how this happened, how they were trying to do the safety test. It got delayed by the workers in Kiev who said, I can't do without the power. So they postponed it to the middle of the night. You now have a supervisor who hasn't slept in 2 days. You have a staff on hand who is inexperienced. So all of your experienced workers were there for the test. Well, they went home at the end of their shift. Now you have this 25-year-old kid who's been working there for 2 months who has to take an RBK-1 reactor from full power down to 200 megawatts per hour, never having done it before. You have moments where they ignore computer warnings, where they ignore other things. And then there's kind of another thing that happens that I'm not going to spoil for the sake of watching the show, where even if they had gotten all that right, they still probably would have messed up because there was something else that they didn't know that they should have known.
The whole thing was made out of pudding because that's all they had.
Well, I mean, and it leads to a very sad story. So your main character, who's played by Jared Harris, the Valery Legasov, commits suicide shortly after.
Today on a very depressing Dreamland.
Well, and it's
we're
because
talking about Chernobyl and suicide.
Sorry. Everybody's like, I love listening to this show.
They're like, turning
it's
it
so
off,
funny.
super bummed out.
Well, yeah, you're right. Chernobyl, I've been steeping
I'm not telling
in it
you
for
not
days.
to say it. I'm just acknowledging that it's dark, but I mean, it's very interesting.
The Legasov character was basically promised the world if he didn't tell the truth. He did a beautiful job of talking to the world about what happened without giving away the Soviet the thing we should have known that we didn't know. And then when he gets back to Russia and starts trying to talk to his peers, because there's a lot of these reactors around and they all have this flaw.
Oh.
And he's going, he's hell bent for leather. We're going to fix these reactors. And so
now that song's in my head.
The KGB steps in and starts to take away his life. Like there's a powerful scene in the movie, another spot where he took a lot of literary license, where the actual director of the KGB is looking at him and saying, your legacy will belong to someone else. Everything good you've ever done will be given credit to someone else, and you will die forgotten and alone. And it's so frightening because they're sitting in like in a kitchen, surrounded by refrigerator equipment, and you don't know what's about to happen to him if he's about to be shot. And he just basically says, no, you'll get to live, but nothing you've accomplished will be given credit to you. You'll go to work every day and no one will talk to you. You will have no friends. And you just see the power of this organization as it comes in and just sort of chokes the light out of this man who has basically given his life to fix this problem because he's exposed himself to radiation, been in places he shouldn't have gone, and then with nothing to show for it. And it was because he made a recording of all of his findings and shared them out with all the other people in the community before he ended his own life, sadly, that had finally started happening where people would, too many people knew. They started to fix the reactors and get all of these things repaired. So it's a very powerful story of kind of how this guy gave everything, didn't get a lot for it, but still had this huge impact. And I feel very much like the show is for him. So there were some moments that didn't happen the way that they're depicted, but they do give him that moment to be heroic. One of them being in the very last episode, there's a trial where he wasn't there, but the show puts him there where he has several moments to sort of take the moral high road.
Right. Well, I was looking while you were talking just at some photos from the show and sort of get an idea of the look, which at least in these photos are very beautiful. The cinematography looks really cool. And there's a lot of that surgical scrub green color.
Yeah, a little bit of that matrix green.
Matrix green. That's another good way of putting it. Yeah. And I saw this one with this image that said, Chernobyl broke a Game of Thrones. And I'm like, what? And so I clicked on it. It's a Forbes article. And the full title is Chernobyl broke a Game of Thrones record for HBO. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot more sense.
Well, it's funny that you say that because I'm going to go ahead and wind down here. Obviously, I could talk about it for a long time. So feel free to drop us a note if you've got any ideas, things I missed, or just want to yell at me. Feel free to do that. But there was a lot of, I brought up Game of Thrones earlier because the last episode of this 5-episode series, so it's hard to compare it to something that with so many seasons, with so many assets pointed at it, it is a masterpiece of a final episode. I had gotten through the 4 episodes leading up to it, and I was like, I've seen the reactor explode. I've seen the artistic depiction of what an open reactor would look like. I mean, I'd seen a lot of the things that just sort of tantalized my imagination. What are we going to do for a final episode? Oh, we're going to put them on a show trial and we're going to watch that. Well, they juxtaposed a reenactment of what happened in the control room minute by minute with a show trial where the 3 principal actors get up and talk about what went wrong that night. So they sort of go back and forth between them describing it in the trial room with the 3 villains, if you will, on display. And then they go back to the thing and you actually see them do, you see them have the meeting where they say, we're still going to do the safety test. You see them say, do the stupid thing with the reactor. And the guy goes, no, I'm not going to do it, but without the Russian accent. And then
you just wanted to do it.
Right. And then the guy goes, well, I'll ruin your life if you don't do it, even though he had a British accent. And then, oh my gosh, the power's dropping to this, and so you get all of that. But for some reason, it's extraordinarily well done. And it's like oversimplified without being insulting. You get why this nuclear reactor ran away. You actually understand why the memes you've seen that say positive void coefficient, why that means something. Because they literally take cards, like red means bad, green means good, and they say, well, they did this, and they plop a green card up. And then they say, and then they did that, and it pops a red card up. And you see how every step creates this very tenuous balance inside of a nuclear reactor. And then by the end, he starts to take cards off and show how every decision they made took away all the greens and left only the reds. And it was things that if you were paying attention, you would have noticed. If you were, if you got the ego out of the way, you wouldn't have set that up. But they set up this situation where there was like, we are extraordinarily lucky as a race, like as a human race, that they didn't poison half the planet with this, accident.
Well, do you think that scene was something the filmmaker just had in his mind and that everything else sort of fell into place to sort of set the stage for that scene? Like, sometimes you get the idea that when you're reading a book or watching a movie that one key part is so powerful and well done that must have been the stroke of genius, the vision that artist came up with. Like, I've got to have that scene. So how do I kind of get it there? Or do you think it was all just sort of, it just sort of happened that it led to that? Because there's obviously, even if those things happened, it didn't happen in that exact way. So like you were saying, he took artistic license.
Yeah, one of the principal actors doesn't exist. They represent a body of people. The other 2 weren't there at the show trial. But everything that he depicts happening to him or that he did over a longer period of time in other ways, but it would have not have been interesting to see. It would have been him in an elevator with somebody saying, spoiler item, should have been caught. And the other guy going, you shouldn't have said that. And then a phone call's made. And then he goes home and there's another car parked in front of his house. Like, it's all just this long,
So it would have been
slow,
like watching the X-Files.
Yeah, it would have been this long, slow burn.
Slow burn that doesn't ever go anywhere.
Yeah, and so they gave it all one episode. So to answer your question, I definitely think this scene was always in the director or the writer's head from the beginning. But if you watch the show, there's a lot of scenes where people get their moments, and there's the sad and there's the happy and there's the good and there's the bad. This just, I think, was one of the strongest, especially finding out, like, a lot of the other ones actually did happen the way that they were depicted. But this one they did sort of fiddle with and created this caricature of a Russian show trial to sort of warp us forward and to like all the way through things that happened over many years. They really did have a show trial. They really did have it at Chernobyl while it was still heavily irradiated, because there's some weird Soviet idea that you have to have trials near where the crime occurred. So they really could have waived that, but instead they were like, hey, wash your shoes. Don't breathe a lot outside. We're going to Chernobyl today. So there's a lot there. And just to kind of round it out, there's been a lot of memes that I've seen and a lot of social impacts for this show. There's been a lot of memes. The one that I think I've got up here in my show notes, so you can add it if you want to, that is of the guy who was running the entire control room. He's sitting behind a table, and it says in the front, it says, you didn't see graphite on the ground because it's not there. Changed my mind. Because in the show, he famously just refuses to believe that the reactor has exploded. Like, for 3 episodes, he refuses to admit. He thinks it was something else. And it's because he just can't bring himself to admit that he screwed up that bad.
Right.
Some of the other ones are, we should put that on our money, talking about, the way they reacted to certain phrases that were said. And the other thing that famously happens is when they call to find out how much radiation there is, they say there's something like 2.6 Röntgens of radiation. And they're like, that's just like, 4 chest x-rays. It's not that bad. And of course, scientist is sitting there at the table and goes, that's the maximum level on the small sensors they have in the room. Like, so they're just calling back and saying, oh, it's just 2.6 Röntgens. Right. Well, it's maxed out.
So they're trying to minimize it so that they don't all freak out.
Oh, it was like 25,000. I mean, it was an astonishingly high amount of
So what
radiation.
you're saying is there could be things like now that we should all be freaking out about, but we're just saying it's not that bad. It's fine.
Yeah, and it's being
but
used.
But you should be panicking.
It's being used a lot. Yeah. I think the other thing they say is, why worry about something that could never happen? Talking about one of these reactors exploding. Because it was the Soviet
the Titanic
truth.
Can't sink.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that reiterates through this, where they just believe that something is true so hard that they refuse to see what's happening right in front of them. And so just to sort of, like I said, I was rounding it off. There's a couple of notes I made. I mentioned the book Midnight in Chernobyl. It is very good. It's very long and it's very detailed. So if you're into this whole story, it's a great place to go and find out what's going on there. The show podcast is available on iTunes or on YouTube or other places, and I do recommend it. It's especially hearing Jack Siegel, the NPR host, or PRI, Public Radio International. John Siegel. He does the game show.
Siegel.
Just Siegel.
Peter Siegel?
Someone Siegel?
Jack Siegel.
He's not a bird. His last name is just
Livingston Siegel.
Oh, thank you. I like his hats. The other thing I wanted to note, this writer took a very bold move, and director. They have made their scripts publicly available. So if you're interested in seeing how the show itself was made, down to the notes on, enter stage left, so-and-so drinking an entire bottle of vodka at one go because they actually believed it would help with radiation poisoning. So they issued free vodka to all the workers.
It helps with you not caring about
I think that might have been it.
Yeah.
So you can go see all the scripts, and any lines you couldn't catch because they were had a British accent on them, you can
or you can just turn on those subtitles like I do.
And just get I bet you there's a text to speech.
British people, I must have subtitles. Actually, that's not true. I always have subtitles because I have a hearing loss.
I do too, because I have children. So either I don't want them to hear or I can't hear, so I have to put that on.
Right.
Or if you have access to a text-to-speech thing that has a Soviet accent, you could play the scripts back through that.
Nice.
And the final one being this documentary that I'm sure I mentioned the last time I talked about this, called The Russian Woodpecker. It was available on Netflix, but I wanted to bring it up for an honorable mention. This follows a boy who is a child of someone affected by Chernobyl.
So this is an actual documentary.
This is an actual documentary, but it's also weird. Is
it Russian?
It's told by a Ukraine, like someone from the Ukraine.
Okay.
He's an artist from Ukraine, and he's not okay. Like, whether it's, I'm not pointing at specifically a mental problem or anything, but his heart's on his sleeve. He's messed up about what happened, and he thinks it was all a cover up for that Duga installation I brought up last time. So he thinks there was something more nefarious. This TV show and reading the Midnight in Chernobyl leads me to believe, no, it was probably just plain old human error and greed and stupidity. But it is still, The Russian Woodpecker is a fascinating look at this guy, and it's almost just sort of a snapshot of, even if you don't buy into his conspiracy theory, you will watch it and go, look at how this whole thing has affected a whole generation of kids. Like this kid's problems, whether they're related to the radiation or just because his whole family got uprooted and now he's emotionally messed up, either is valid. And this is a good example of that.
It sounds like, either side of that coin, you're talking about how, strong belief can really you can blind yourself to the reality because you're like, nope, I'm going to believe this thing. I'm just going to dig in and just keep believing this thing.
I mean, you did not see graphite on the ground because there is no graphite on the ground. Change my mind. Mm-hmm.
And the more someone tries to explain it, the more you're like, nope.
Yeah.
Yeah, we see a lot of that in life.
Yeah, but the truth is, there was a lot going on with the Soviet Union that was scary and terrible. Everybody has their own stuff that they keep, in the back room when their guests are over. Don't let grandma out. She'll start yelling about stuff. But the people were pretty heroic, pretty selfless. And there were a lot of things in here that you'll look back and go, would I do that? Would I go wading down into waist deep water underneath an active open?
The answer is probably not.
And there were people who said, I will, because they knew that it would save half of Europe from a devastating poisonous cloud.
Right.
So it is stuff to sort of...
So it kind of makes me want to watch. Like when you first told me, I was kind of bummed out that it wasn't a documentary, but now I'm kind of intrigued and now I do want to watch it.
Yeah.
And since I still have HBO...
the funny thing about this is when I realized I wanted to do this, I hadn't finished it. I went home and I watched the end, like the final episode of this, and got an email 30 minutes later saying that your HBO subscription has now terminated.
Yeah.
Because we had canceled it after the Game of Thrones finale, and it took that long. But I literally got the last episode in minutes before they cut it off.
Good.
All right. So
that was great.
That's
makes me want to watch the show.
Everything I love about studying the Soviet Union. And the other thing about Midnight in Chernobyl is there's more disasters that happen there that have been covered up. So
there is a conspiracy. It's just not the conspiracy that some people think.
Well, I mean, there was this idea that the Soviet Union did not have nuclear disasters. And that was maintained at the end of a gun. And, that's the question that I think everybody watching the show is asking. Okay, so are we perfect? That kind of thing.
It's interesting that you picked that topic because, and I kind of knew that that's what you were going to do because you sort of made a veiled
I tipped my hand in the live stream.
A little bit in the live stream. But I was going around looking for like, what do I want to do? What do I want to do for this episode? And I kind of went down my own rabbit hole and I came across this thing. So while that was happening, Chernobyl was happening, and it happened in the 80s. I don't remember what year it was exactly, but during that same time period in the United States.
It was April 26th, 1986 at 1:23 in the morning, 45 seconds thereafter. Boom.
Wow. Okay, that's really specific.
Thanks.
So remember Satanic Panic?
I do.
Here in the United States. I would love for us to do a whole show, a whole episode just about Satanic Panic. But in my part of this, since I have half a show, I kind of want to go into just one little facet of that. So just to give a real quick overview, in the 80s, people said that Satan was doing all kinds of things to get at kids and teens in particular, including backmasking of satanic messages in rock music, Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal music as occult recruiting tools, disappearing pets and poisoned candy at Halloween, which we've talked about, as part of a larger conspiracy, and most significantly, underground movements of Satanists engaged in human sacrifice, breeding of children for the same, and ritual child abuse and other crimes such as sexual assaults to children. So you went dark. I'm going to go dark in a different way.
Yes.
So the things that may have led to Satanic Panic coming up, and it sort of started really in the early 70s. In 1968, of course, we remember Rosemary's Baby came out, which was like this whole Satanist thing. And then in 69, there were the Manson murders. And then in the 70s, lots of serial killers were kind of a thing. Son of Sam, all that kind of stuff. And in 69, also Anton LaVey published the Satanic Bible. And then in 71 and then 73, respectively, there was the book and the film of The Exorcist. So people had Satan on the brain and people doing really evil things that didn't seem like it had ever happened before. So if they felt like there was this evil force. Also, women were going to work for the first time. So there were a lot of latchkey kids, and kids were going into daycare, and parents had this sort of nervousness about leaving their children.
I was like, wow, that is a hard left turn.
Well, people were scared that they were leaving their kids for the first time as a culture with other people that weren't their parents.
Or by themselves.
Completely, like many of us in the 80s. There was this also emerging awareness that horrible things can happen to kids. So, like, remember the milk cartons and the kids on the milk cartons and all that kind of stuff.
That was a haunting during mini breakfasts, is to sit and stare at the back of a milk carton and just wonder, where is that kid?
Mm-hmm. And then the things that it caused actually include lots of trials and convictions of innocent people for supposed satanic ritual abuse or murder. You kind of alluded to that earlier, some of whom are still in prison. This includes things like the McMartin preschool abuse cases, the West Memphis 3, and the San Antonio 4. So there were a lot of people who were wrongfully convicted of crimes that, was all just because people were in this complete mania about Satan. So what you may not know is that there's one man in particular who essentially started and then inadvertently stopped or started the decline of Satanic Panic. And his name is Mike Warnke.
Okay. Not familiar with the name.
Okay. Well, we'll see if any of this starts to sound familiar to you, because I know you kind of grew up with a pretty Christian knowledge base. So in 1972, he had a book that was published called The Satan Seller, in which he claims to have become a satanic high priest who then converted to Christianity. However, in the 90s, there was a Christian magazine called Cornerstone that debunked the book by interviewing nearly everyone who knew this guy, Mike Warnke, and documenting that they all tell a very different story, and they all tell the same story, just different from what he said about his life events. Warnke is not the only Christian pop culture icon who claimed to have been a Satanist during that time, and he's certainly not the only one whose story was debunked, but he was probably the biggest and definitely was the first. So I thought basically I would just tell you kind of the story of him and how he basically started the whole Satanic Panic thing. I mean, he didn't completely start it, but he really started spooling up this idea of, organized groups of Satanists. So Mike Warnke was born in 1946 to Al and Louise Warnke, and when he was 5, they moved to Manchester, Tennessee, where his father opened a truck stop. In 55, his mother was killed in a car accident. And then in 58, his father died, so he was an orphan. After his father's death, he was taken to live with 2 of his aunts in Tennessee, and from there he was sent to live with his half-sister and her husband in San Bernardino, California. His Aunt Edna sent lots of anti-Catholic materials with him when she sent him out there to live in California with all the Catholics, because apparently his half-sister was Catholic. And so being from Tennessee, they were all much more evangelical folks. Mm-hmm. So, but he got really interested in Catholicism, and he got confirmed in high school. So in June of 65, he graduated from Rim of the World High School in Lake Arrowhead. That is the coolest high school name I've ever heard. It sounds
fictional to me.
Doesn't it? But it's not.
It sounds like the name of a Tom Cruise movie.
Rim of the World High School. It sounds like something that if you put it in a book or something, people would go, that's too much. You need to dial that back.
But this is one of the true things.
It's true.
Okay.
Yep. I actually looked it up because I was like, nuh-uh. All right. So I'm going to sort of go back and forth with, I got a lot of this obviously from just Wikipedia, but then also the article itself that Cornerstone published that has tons and tons of research. It's very long. So everybody they talked to who knew Mike at that high school, RIM, they call it RIM, remembers him as a chronic storyteller. He did this thing where this guy, Jeff, who was his friend, said, Mike talked me into dropping him and his date off at a restaurant and then picking them up after dinner. Before we picked up the date, we stopped at a local uniform store and got me a chauffeur's cap. From the moment the girl got into the car, Mike spun this wild tale about me being an orphan boy and how his family had taken me in and how I sometimes performed various services for them, such as being their chauffeur. She just soaked it all in. So even in high school, he was kind of like, telling these very crazy stories. I don't know. Have you ever known anybody like that who just it's almost embarrassing when people do that, where you're like, little kids will do it. They make up stuff like, I have a brother, but they don't really. You ever know an adult who does that?
I mean, I can say that I've been around people who do things like that to be funny. The intention is not to continue to have that person believe this fiction. It's to sort of just entertain. And yes, sometimes I can go too far. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I could see even I would do something like act like I work at a place long enough for the person to believe it and then be like, I'm just kidding. I just
but there's no I'm just kidding. It's just
I haven't known anybody who takes it all the way.
Just all the way. It's a little scary. So
I mean, because do they believe this?
Yeah.
About themselves?
Well, I kind of feel like I don't know. And that's kind of where this all is going to go, is what do we think is going on in his brain? Because it almost seems like he has convinced himself that all this stuff really happened. But so that September, he started San Bernardino Valley College, but then he withdrew after one semester and he dropped out. This is documented on September 13th, 1965. So we're just going to put a pin in that date because we're going to come back to it in a minute. So
okay.
When he drops out, the story starts he starts meeting, according to the book, he meets this guy named Dean Armstrong, who Warnke alleges was a satanic high priest. And Mike says that Dean lured him into drug use, sexual promiscuity, witchcraft, and Satanism. Mike's associates at school affirmed that no one among them remotely resembled the Dean character in the book. So all of the Cornerstone folks, who, by the way, are, like I said, a Christian magazine.
I do remember seeing that on the racks.
Right. They went around and interviewed all of his high school friends, all of his college friends, his ex-wives, as the story goes
Ex-wives?
on. Yes, multiple. So
this man has led many lives.
according to the book, Mike was encouraged by Dean to quit drinking so much and start smoking marijuana.
Okay.
Which I guess he's trying to forward as being really bad. So the people that they interviewed said none of us were into drugs. We didn't even smoke cigarettes. Yet in the Satan Cellar, Warnke and his friends are allegedly full-blown drug users early in the year. So he says, when we tried the peyote, we decided it was better and heavier than pot. We also started eating mescaline in our food in increasing quantities. And from there, we went on to reds. And then he says that doctors came to the campus to conduct controlled group experiments on LSD with the students at this small valley
before
junior
or after
college.
Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas was written?
1965.
Yeah,
So,
I don't know off the top of my head when
I don't know
when he wrote that. But it sounds a lot like he's been reading a little gonzo journalism here. How far were you out of Barstow when this started, buddy?
I mean, so then, so Greg Gilbert and the others, so this was a guy that he knew in college. They use first and last names, which makes all of this even more interesting. That it's not like they hid any of these people's identities. They just published all of their names in this article. They saw Mike on a daily basis and say it's completely impossible for him to have had, as he describes, hepatitis, facial scabs from injecting crystal, and wounds from being shot 3 times. So they're like, there's no way that we would not have known about that. It's got to be a lie. Just before he published The Satan Cellar in 1973, and when I say Satan Cellar, I mean like someone who sells Satan, not like there's a cellar below the house that's full of Satan. It's more like cellar S.
You don't go through the cellar door.
Right. Right. So anyway, back before he published the book, he brought manuscript copies to his old high school friends, not the college friends, but his high school friends, Jeff and Tim, and asked them to sign affidavits swearing the events depicted were true.
Which is suspicious in itself.
Right. So Jeff had lost track of Warnke after high school and had no idea what he did during college. And Mike asked Jeff to join a coven like on a rare visit, but Jeff had laughed it off, thinking it was just another one of the crazy stories, because he was like the boy that cried wolf kind of thing. So in any event, when Warnke asked Jeff to sign the affidavit, he was like, this is poppycock. That's literally the quote. I'm like, okay.
All right.
I really enjoyed, this is my favorite part, I think, of this story. So in The Satan Cellar, Warnke describes the exterior of his apartment in this way. It's a second-floor apartment approached by an outside stairway. So this is like where he's living in, like after he drops out of college and when he's being like this huge satanic high priest. The interior, however, was redecorated by the Satanists after Warnke became a high priest. So this is like verbatim from the book. A long, low oxblood leather couch replaced the sagging old brown horsehair one, and there were 2 sets of bookshelves full of books on the occult. The biggest surprise was on the floor, 2 chicks sitting on a white rug. "We hope you like it, Mike, because we come with this apartment," said the blonde one named Lorraine.
Okay.
I mean... So it just sounds like someone's writing into Penthouse Forum. It's really just what it sounds like.
What happens when they need to sleep or go to the bathroom?
Well, they were just apparently his love slaves, to put it nicely. And they just kind of hung out there in the apartment and were at his beck and call whenever. Like the girls laying all over Paul Stanley in the Decline of Western Civilization movie that we watched.
Yeah, this is very much like that. Like, here, believe this is a real thing.
So the 2 women allegedly remained at his beck and call and rarely left the apartment unless it was to get him groceries or drugs. This is a fantasy, says a friend of his from high school named Dennis and college. And Greg Gilbert says he never knew Mike Warnke to have a girlfriend in college besides Lois. None of the college friends who frequented the apartment ever saw occult books, an oxblood leather couch, or 2 love slaves. Interestingly, and I'll sort of talk about this a little more, his girlfriend during college's name was Lois.
Right.
But when you read any of his books and later he becomes a Christian comedian, he doesn't ever mention her. The only person he mentions is his first wife. So we'll get to that in a second. So he details like participation in orgies, alcoholism, drug dealing. And then he eventually says that he summoned demons and was involved in a ritual kidnap and rape. So kind of crazy that he would say that he was involved in all of these things, but then he never gives names or tries to like speak out against the other people who were involved. Like once he becomes a Christian, you would think he would like go to the authorities and say, hey, you know, these people were with me when I did these things and these crimes were committed.
Well, why even say anything about you being a part of it unless you're also tearing down everything else that surrounded it?
Well, the reason why in this case is for money, because he made a lot of money with these books. And
we'll enjoy the investigation that goes along with it.
He never got him. That's the crazy part, too, is it's the 70s, so no one was investigating that yet.
Yeah. Okay.
So he says, I had white hair. It was about down to my belt. I had 6-inch fingernails. I painted them black. He says he was intentionally overdosed with heroin by one of the live-in love slaves and then thrown naked on the steps of a local hospital by them, I guess. And if you see this guy, he's a very heavy-set, kind of a chunky guy with like the long mullety kind of hair. And it's just sort of like, it's hard to imagine like a girl just chucking him naked out of a car. It's a funny image, I gotta say. So he says after a few weeks of drying out at the hospital, he escaped by joining the Navy. So
what?
Oh, that's the part you have a problem with? Okay.
Well, I mean, there's just only so many coins you can put on that side of the scale. It's like, hey, Navy, here's this druggie that's overweight. Go for it.
So on his album, Mike Warnke Alive, he describes his hair length as hitting him just below the pockets. And I'm only talking about that because he says, the night before I went to boot camp, I went to this party. I smoked a bunch of dope, ate a bunch of Reds, got crashed out in a corner, and that this girl was like braiding his hair. So he said this in the 70s. So Lois, who was his college girlfriend, as I said, says that she was the girl who gave Mike his going away party. And when she heard the story for the first time in 1979, she was really pissed off. And she says, I couldn't believe it when I heard that. I'm the one who gave him that going away party. We never touched drugs. He never had long hair. His hair was short, short, short. There are photos to back that up from this time, that his hair was really short. So, you know, I don't know if people realize it takes longer than just like 9 months to grow your hair from like being short to like your waist. So
it's a very long time. Yes.
She says, I bought a big cake decorated with a Navy boat. Lois remembers. It said, ship ahoy, Mike. Dawn and I made food and pop, and we had a bunch of people over. It was just good, clean fun. So I'm envisioning this like Publix cake with a boat on it.
Ships ahoy.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been a Publix cake probably, but nonetheless. So anyway.
Was Albertsons a thing then?
I don't know. Good question. So Lois says that when he came back from boot camp, he was carrying a Bible and he was no longer Catholic. He said that he had found Christ at boot camp. And that what's interesting is that Mike leaves Lois, again, completely out of this story and only mentions the woman that he ended up marrying, whose name was Sue Studer. In order to get away, he says that he was trying to get away with all these Illuminati-level Satanists who were on his trail, and that's why he joined the Navy. So on June 2nd, 1966, he enlists in the Navy. So
he really did join the Navy.
He did.
He didn't seem physically fit.
No, 100%. I mean, he was skinnier, I think, when he was that age, probably.
Okay.
So after graduating from boot camp in August, he went to Vietnam. And the book says he was a hero in Vietnam, and he found Jesus and came home as an evangelist.
Sounds like he does that a lot.
And he ends with living happily in California with Sue Studer, and then it became a religious bestseller. So I just want to point out that it was between September of 65 and June of 66 that he achieved all of this stuff that happens.
That is a remarkably short amount of time.
Right. It's like less than 9 months to get involved with drugs, become addicted to drugs, like have this introduction to Satanism, and then to become a high priest and travel all around and develop a following of 1,500 people is what he says.
And to be shot 3 times?
And to be shot 3 times.
And have facial scarring that's now gone.
Facial scarring and hepatitis and a lot of things. So I'm just saying, okay. So in 1962, the book gets released, and it launched him into stardom with evangelical Christian communities. So he became a very popular speaker at Christian meeting places such as Melodyland in California. And then in November of 75 at an Indiana coffee house, he's talking about his conversion from Satanism to Christianity, and it was incidentally recorded. And so that became his first album, called Alive, which was soon widely played on Christian radio. So around this time, he left his wife Sue for his girlfriend Carolyn that he was cheating on Sue with. So there's going to be a lot of that happens. So like he'll be married to one person, but then he finds somebody else, he starts cheating with them, and then he leaves that wife for the next wife. So he became a popular speaker in the evangelical circuit thanks to his shocking testimony, and according to him, he started using humor to tell his story because otherwise it was just too depressing. In time, he moved kind of more away from the titillating satanic material and focused almost completely on wholesome family entertainment with a Christian message. And his ministry brought in millions of dollars and basically created the Christian comedy industry.
Interesting.
So it's weird because it seems like he might have, at least for Christian comedy, he might have just an aptitude, and he could have just done that. But instead, he had to use the shock value thing. Some of the extravagant claims that he made in 1982, he began to exaggerate a lot of his achievements. So during the 80s, he claims that his claims of academic degrees increased from 2 bachelor's degrees to 2 master's degrees, and then to a doctorate of philosophy. He doesn't have a degree, I don't believe, at all. In the Satan Cellar...
So like none of
right.
the above, okay.
So in the Satan Cellar, he says he was wounded, because remember, he dropped out of community college after 1 semester.
Yeah.
And then joined the Navy. So.
It's hard to keep up, but yes, I do recall you saying that.
Okay. So he says in the Satan Cellar that he was wounded twice in Vietnam, and hitchhiking on Hope Street, which this was he has a lot of comedy albums that he put out. That's one of those.
One of them's called Hitchhiking on Hope Street.
Yes. He says he had been wounded 5 times. He also said that he had 1,500 people in his coven, but later said it was only 13. Now, I think he did actually get a Purple Heart in Vietnam, so I don't want to try to take anything away from him if he actually did heroic stuff and things like that, but I'm just saying he does his tales get bigger every time he tells the story.
Right.
He's I caught a fish this big guy. So on May 16th, 85, he appeared in a primetime news report about Satanism, which a lot of people probably remember, which was on ABC's 2020. So if you want to watch one of the most cringy things that you've ever seen, it's out on YouTube in little parts. You can watch that 2020, and it's just filled with completely unsubstantiated Satanism rhetoric that just got people completely freaked out about, ritual animal mutilations and, murders. But it's like they were all just kind of like these completely unrelated murders that they're all saying was like this network of Satanists. They had no basis for that.
Like there was some conspiracy. I remember growing up and being afraid to go, as kids we wander, right? We go wandering around in the woods and other things like that. It became a thing that we were like, ooh, don't go there. There's Satanists there.
Right.
I mean, all through elementary, middle, and high school, it was always this like, hey, do you hear about that cornfield over there? Don't go there. Satanists show up at midnight and have rituals.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly being in the South, that was definitely like the scariest thing you could say to kids, was something about Satanists. And so I think that for myself, when I was in high school and just being irritated with everyone I went to high school with, I picked that as the thing, hail Satan, just to stick it to him. Because I thought it was nonsense, but they really freaked out about it. So I thought it was hilarious to constantly tell them.
I'm glad you're still with us because, that was an isolated part of the world.
I know, could have been bad. Anyway, in the show's episode it's called The Devil Worshippers, Warnke was included in a number of segments where he discussed the implements and clothing used in satanic ceremonies. So when I'm watching that segment, he's got things like an athame, which is sort of a pagan-y ritual knife that's just sort of used for...
So it's a knife.
It's a knife, yes.
Gotcha.
And so he has all these things that are very normal within like occult circles, like
a magic knife.
tools, but it's sort of all like symbolism and stuff like that. And then I think there's like the people who really get into just trying. I swear to God, I think people just try to freak like hardcore Christian people out by spooling that up. So I think a lot of kids and other people say a lot of this stuff just for shock value. Like, you know, when kids are trying to be bad kids, you know, like they're digging in, they're like, you know, hail Satan, you know, when they get arrested and stuff. And they're like, yeah, kind of like I did, where there's no real meaning behind it. They're not actually doing any of that crap. They're just saying it to freak people out because it's fun.
I'd say 90% of the time, if not more, that's probably what's happening.
Pretty much, yes.
Whatever they think you don't like, they gonna like it.
Right. So he says that he has this scar, and he shows the scar, which allegedly is where he was repeatedly cut so that his blood could be used in satanic ceremonies. And he talks about what drew him to Satanism. So after that 2020 appearance, he was frequently cited as an expert on the occult by Christian radio host Bob Larson and the Chick publications, which were those little... I'm sure you had to see these because even I saw these, and I only went to church like twice in my life. So they were these little tracts. They had little, it was like a comic book, and it was all like about how like Halloween is evil. That was like the most popular one. It was a Chick tract. The guy's name, I think, is Jack Chick.
I've seen stuff like that everywhere. You could run into it in bathrooms, in public bathrooms and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that guy was sort of like the main person who created a lot of those little religious tracts, and they were almost all about Satanism being pervasive everywhere. So at the height of Satanic Panic, the media was playing this huge role in stoking the public's fear and fueling all these misconceptions surrounding occult practices. So in 1988, Geraldo Rivera had this really lurid documentary called Devil Worship, exposing Satan's underground, that became the highest rated televised documentary to air up until that point. And then after that, of course, the 1991-2020 thing. Evangelical documentaries like Hell's Bells attempted to tie rock music to the occult, and there were just all these different people who were
Which I've seen Hell's Bells.
Yeah? How is it?
I mean, you know, it's about how do you expect at this age, but, you know, gets a lot of exercise, eats fairly well. So, you know, still kind of with us, you know, a little bright.
All right.
Yeah. Depends on the day, you know, that kind of thing.
So I've got a photo here that I'll post that I got out of one of the many. There's a ton of information about this because after this article broke in the early 90s, there's different dates on when this Cornerstone article came out. It shows Warnke's annual income. So in 1984, his annual income was $34,000. And then in 1990, it was $239,000 a year. And his wife's was $230,000 a year. So they were definitely bringing in the bucks like, you know, Jim and Tammy Faye style. So in 1990, it was 92, when Cornerstone magazine ran the lengthy expose, and it is lengthy. So, I mean, it took me a couple hours to read the whole thing. They debunked nearly every claim that he had made about his nefarious past. They provided photographic evidence that rather than having waist-length white hair and 6-inch long fingernails, as he claimed in the mid-'60s, he was a straight-laced, unassuming nerd.
Well, I immediately thought, you've seen the cover of Hotel California? Mm-hmm. Remember the guy who's standing at the top of the banister with the long hair?
Yeah.
And I immediately was trying to figure out, is he trying to pretend to be that guy at this point?
Maybe.
Because that guy, I believe, is a famous satanic like Satanist. I tried to come up with the right name for it. But I believe he is associated with the Satanic Church. Because I remember it being like a point of like, hey, Dad's like, hey, I like this album. That guy's weird kind of thing, you know? I mean, we were a pretty reasonable family. So we'd have the Eagles album in the house. And they'd just be like, that guy's kind of, I don't know what's going on with him.
So this article also revealed the scandalous details of his multiple marriages, and then also his ministry's varied financial indiscretions.
So was this just a hit piece? Like, who did this? I mean,
I'm
you said it was
there.
Cornerstone. Okay.
I'm getting there. So the article was devastating to Warnke's career, and his record label dropped him, and Warnke Ministries closed its doors. And of course, they were definitely bringing in some money. So the speaking engagement stopped, and the world, having grown tired of Satan as the boogeyman du jour, this is what I'm reading this verbatim, dismissed Warnke as a hypocrite and a fraud. So
Such colorful language.
Yes. Cornerstone to answer your question, were made up of Christian writers who were part of Jesus People USA. And that is a Christian commune. They call it an intentional community that still exists today in Chicago. The authors were John Trott and Mike Hertenstein. And they say they wrote the article because it's about truth. The fact is that Christians claim a unique relationship with absolute truth and have a special interest in making sure that there is not deception in their own ranks. From what they say, they just feel very strongly, like they also debunked another woman who said that she had been ritually abused by Satanists, and then later all of that was completely debunked by them. They debunked several of these people who were going around at that time as kind of a thing.
So they kind of had a high purpose, and they had to pick and choose.
Right.
And this guy came under the radar, but they also exonerated. It sounds like they exonerated some Satanists also with this. Like they were fairly fair-handed. You said she was ritually abused by...
She wasn't, though.
Right. She claimed it.
And
so they debunked that. Mm-hmm. So that sounds like a fairly even-handed approach, whether they agree with you or not.
Yeah, and they were not, because
truth.
They are in a commune. They don't make money.
Right.
So they're not motivated by that. Like, because they asked them in this article that I'll post on the show notes, what were you paid to write this article? And they were like, room and board, because that's just sort of how the commune works. So
it's hard to, if you want to fight back, it's hard to fight back against that. I mean,
a lot of people still really, really believe everything that Mike Warnke said, so we'll get to that. So after some initial pushback, Warnke acknowledged that many of the accusations had been made against him. So in an attempt at salvaging his reputation as a minister, he basically submitted himself to the authority of a tribunal board made up of Christian ministers. The tribunal oversaw his career for the next 13 years before eventually releasing him from their authority as a minister in good standing within the Christian community.
Okay.
So it's now been 25 years. This is when this was written, since his career imploded, but Warnke is still traveling the world doing speaking engagements. I looked him up. He's not traveling anymore, but he does still have a ministry. It's out in California, and he does still sell all of his DVDs and books and I guess not VHS tapes, but he does have downloads available on his website. So even now, Warnke denies lying about his involvement with Satanism and the occult. He says that he basically exaggerated just for the purposes of storytelling to make it, more fun to read or more whatever, but that, and he changed some of the details to protect people and all this kind of stuff, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
I mean, I think if you look between the two stories that you heard today, you have a director who told a different story than what happened and then immediately says, here's what I changed, here's how I changed it, here's why I changed
That's exactly what I was thinking.
And then you have this other guy who's just like, yeah, I just sort of made it more entertaining. I did it.
I just play free and loose with the truth.
Yeah, I can tell you which one I have more respect for in the moment here.
Warnke's third wife, Rose Hall Warnke, she published a book called The Great Pretender in 1985, which was
name.
a book that chronicles in the most flamboyantly bizarre fashion this work that was being done at Warnke Ministries. That's what I'm, again, reading that verbatim. So she says that 7 years before the Cornerstone expose, this was when this book was published, obviously, she discusses all of his cheating on her, his weird personal habits, which included him dressing up in a bishop's robe while in the privacy of their home. And if you go back through the Cornerstone article, they talk about, even back in college, that he loved putting on bishop's robes and religious robes and just going out to, like, hang out with friends. Like dressed like a priest or a bishop or something like that. And then she also talked about all of their weird IRS dealings and problems with their financials and stuff like that. All of that book has tons of full color photographs of all of these things. So it's weird. Warnke does talk about, that he only embellished his story to make it a better narrative. So he's now married to his fourth wife. They got married in 91, so I guess it was right before that Cornerstone article came out. They have...
That's a heck of a way to test things starting out, isn't it?
Right. So what did all of this mean for Satanic Panic in general? So in 1992, the Department of Justice published a monograph for investigators that was written by this guy, Kenneth Lanning, who was an agent with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico. And it basically debunked all of the claims of systemic ritual occult abuse in America. it was really kind of the first critical examination on a wide scale that had ever been done about debunking all of these supposed indicators of satanic crime, including all the heavy metal stuff and Dungeons and Dragons and all of these accusations that have been, going around and around, and all the different court cases like Judas Priest and, all of that. Ozzy Osbourne. I mean, Ozzy's in the Geraldo Rivera special. If you go and watch that, it's painful.
He crops up a lot of places.
He does. He's sort of like the poster child for heavy metal, evil, whatever.
And now he's beloved. He's like the beloved grandfather.
He's just a
evil.
doddering old man now. He was surprisingly coherent.
Surprisingly, with a Russian accent.
But it's super authentic.
Right.
Although accusations of satanically motivated child abuse rituals had pretty much died out by the mid-90s, law enforcement continued to treat Satan as a potential criminal indicator. So there was this 1994 police training video. So this is like 94, like a couple years after the Department of Justice thing, which is like a police training video called The Law Enforcement Guide to Satanic Cults. This was, if you've heard of this at all, it's probably because it was featured on Red Letter Media has Best of the Worst.
I haven't seen that one, but I've heard of Best of the Worst.
It's called, this one's Wheel of the Worst. So Wheel of the Worst number 18 has the Law Enforcement Guide to Satanic Cults on it. So I definitely recommend that. Check it out. It's really, really funny. But I love those guys. So
What do you mean you love those guys?
In that tape or whatever, there's this guy, Eric Pryor, who claimed to be a Wiccan turned Christian. And so similarly, but he says instead of being a Satanist, he says he was a Wiccan. But he kind of uses those words interchangeably, and it's almost like, do you really know what a Wiccan is?
Yeah, instantly I've got one eyebrow curiously raised.
Right. So when you go onto, there's a webpage for witches that's been around since the 90s, like Alta Vista days.
Oh
it's
my
called
gosh. There's
Witch
a blast
Box.
from the past.
I mean, and it is
you
like...
say Witch Box?
Witch Vox, V-O-X,
Oh,
like witch,
the voice.
the witch's voice is what it stands for. So,
A little Latin.
Yep. So there's this guy he's Canadian. He's a child abuse investigator. He's a detective with the Canadian police. His name is Kerr Kuhulain. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I've never heard it said out loud, but he's sort of notorious on Witchvox and within sort of the pagan community. And he does this full-on takedown of this guy, Eric Pryor, of like how he's gone in and investigated, because Eric Pryor says, I was trained by Lady Sabrina, and then I went to this thing, and then I knew these people, and then I got this degree.
So he accused a bunch of people, and this detective went and actually did his
interviewed
homework.
all those people.
And cleared all those people, I'm assuming.
Well, basically just that he pointed out that they don't know him. He's saying that all these very famous pagan-y people trained him, and that he's like a 7th degree witch or whatever.
And they're all like,
all like, nuh-uh. Nuh-uh. So anyway, that is just one more example. There's a whole lot of other ones. There was a guy, Todd something, that I almost did this about, but it's really dark because he actually did get accused of and was convicted of child abuse and all the stuff. And yeah, so it was a little too dark. But this one is
this
like,
episode could have handled any heavier.
None of this stuff ever really happened.
Right.
So to me, that's why, like at Lent, I said it's fine what I'm talking about, because even though it's really dark, it didn't happen.
Well, on Satanic Pagan, I don't know. I'm saying Satanic Panic.
It's hard to say.
I said Satanic Pagan. But, there was a lot of bluster and a lot of, I just remember, don't do that or don't get involved in that because it's involved with Satan and all this other kind of stuff. And, there was a lot of that now we look back and we look at Metallica now and we go, I don't know what's so menacing about that band, but okay.
Right. But certainly, they have the song Call of Cthulhu. Oh my God,
Oh, the old gods.
Devil.
A little bit of the old gods there. Nice.
So, yeah, I mean, I think all of the things that I sort of mentioned, I was just talking to somebody the other day in passing, and they were talking about how
talking to me, lady.
The Exorcist is real. And I was like, really? Okay. So I think there's still a lot of that some people really still do believe that, Satanists walk among us and control the government, and because that was another thing, too, with the Illuminati tie-in and stuff like that, all of these people not only exist, but have huge, powerful child sex rings and all of this crazy stuff that, it's just like there's Certainly child abuse does happen, and it's horrible. And I think one of the really bad things about this is that, when you get into some of that stuff, it's like you're not actually talking about what really happened to these poor people. You're kind of changing the story and making it about the shock value thing, when the reality is something terrible actually did happen to this person, and it's probably not the teenage boy who has black hair over there that did this thing. It's probably like his stepdad.
So
I'm not talking about the West Memphis 3 at all.
You're tying up valuable resources that are like investigating all of these people just because of what they listen to or how their hair looks. Right. When there are like way more, like Sherlock Holmes would say, if you eliminate all the other things, the only thing left is that one, even though it doesn't make sense.
And then there's Occam's razor. Same
maybe
thing.
More scientific is using Occam's razor than a reference to Sherlock Holmes.
No, I like Sherlock Holmes.
I mean, he's pretty cool. But
So I guess my question about all of this and what I'm left thinking is, obviously, some harm was done by spreading these lies, but does he believe the lies? That doesn't make it okay if he does, but I'm just curious, like, does he really think that all of these things occurred, or is he doing that thing that you talked about a minute ago when you were telling your story, where it's like, I'm just going to keep digging in and that graphite is not there?
I think there's a combination of both, especially when he had so much at stake, whether it be his marriage or his money or just his perception to the community that loved him and adored him. There was definitely going to be some digging in going, this definitely happened. I'm just going to go with that. But at some point when the Cornerstone article comes out, nobody believes it anymore anyway. So you can stick to your guns. So at that point, I could see why he would take a step back and go, well, I may have
embellished, but it's still really true.
Yeah, I mean, all that stuff still basically happened, but, maybe not to the extent that I said it did. Because I was trying to be funny, or, I was trying to save lives.
I was trying to, really drive home my point.
Yeah, how much is too much when you're saving a life? Lie as much as you need to, right? So can you blame me for trying to save a life? Kind of thing going on. And now he's old, and he's probably just like, people, stop talking to me about this. I just want to sell my DVD. And
I just want to be a Christian comedian.
I just kind of want to be a Christian comedian, sell my DVD a little bit, okay, guys? Stop talking to me like that. Hey, Granddad,
if you don't believe
DVDs.
that people still really, really believe everything that was in the Satan Cellar. And if you don't believe me, just go to Amazon and the book page for that book and read the comments
of I'm
all
sure
the
that's
people,
a zoo.
or read the comments for the Cornerstone thing, which was turned into a book. It's on Amazon.
I was wondering how that ended up on Amazon.
And then you go, people slam it, and they're like, Mike Warnke's a great guy, and I loved his comedy when I was growing up, and he's a great guy, and these people are just, anti-Christian, blah, blah, blah.
I mean, in these communities in any community that may feel persecuted at times, or as if there were a higher power at work against them, like a supernatural force of some kind, it is not unusual to see currents run really deep and people say, in spite of what is right in front of me, which could be simulated or a lie in itself.
Or it could be, Chernobyl.
It could be a lot. Yeah. I mean, it's two cases today of situations where someone
That's why I think it's so funny.
It is.
Yours was over in the USSR and mine was
over here.
But it's kind of like, we're just going to believe what we're going to believe, and you can't stop us.
Right. Because if a person believes that their opponent is the master of lies, then no matter how much it makes sense what your opponent's saying, there's still going to be this belief that there's a lie.
Right.
And that they're just better at lying than you are at understanding truth, right? So It doesn't surprise me to see a large group of people who have kept their guns and say, no, this has all been drummed up. I believe this is the guy I believe. It's a little hard to deal with at times, isn't it?
Because, it's just sort
rationality kind of goes, whoop.
Yeah. And then, there are stakes to it.
But for all these fans, are there stakes? It is interesting when people dig in who are just like,
Satanic Panic had big stakes, like I talked about. There are people still in prison today for stuff that was spooled up by complete nonsense.
Oh yeah, they we were talking about earlier. They would raid these communities and arrest everyone, and some of them didn't get out of prison for 10 years.
They would have these techniques that they would apply to questioning children about where did the bad man touch you? And like little 5-year-old kids, you have to be very careful how you lead them because they'll tell you some crazy stuff. As you know, you're a parent. Kids will tell you a crazy story, and they don't necessarily delineate between what they're just making up versus what really happened.
There are times where I'm like halfway down that road, and I'm like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I look over. They're just looking at me like this. There's a little grin on their face. I'm like, you got me again. Dadgummit. Yep. But,
so anyway, that is the insane story of Mike Warnke starting the Satanic Panic. So that's,
wow. I feel like that was a bumpy road.
You were like, oh my God, is she really going here?
Yeah.
I mean, see your face. You were kind of terrified.
Well, I mean, there's some heavy stuff.
But Chernobyl's not.
Yeah. I think I was trying to figure out, any way that I could lighten the load a little bit here, but.
Yeah, it's just heavy. But I mean, I think it's just, I love the sort of mirror effect.
I could see you doing the research and, you got the montage music going on.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, really?
The People's Court?
Is that the same one? Yeah, guilty.
All right. Well, so that was our fun episode. I think it was an interesting blend of topics. It's kind of similar to the other one we did because it's weirdly
we did
similar to the PMRC
and Chernobyl, and then I just went harder into Chernobyl,
and I just went harder into the
Satanic Panic
thing. Yeah,
cool. I think we're going to develop like 2 flavors of our show, where we have some that are just laughs a minute, and then some that are just like, okay, guys, we're going to buckle down and really dig into this one.
Well, yeah. I mean, and I would say that we could go eat Mexican food, but we already did that.
Yeah, so now we'll just order 16 pizzas.
Okay.
And eat those.
That sounds great.
I'll eat 8. You eat 8.
Okay.
Okay, it's a deal.
Deal. All right.
So where can they find our fantastic podcastiness?
They can find that at retroblasting.com/Dreamland.
Is it just me, or did that site start looking real good in the last week or so?
Thanks. I redesigned the site.
No.
Yeah.
It looks sharp.
Thanks. And we're playing with how to renumber the episode numbers so that it sort of shows up better in the Apple Podcast thing because they keep changing their background.
I don't like changing for Apple, but whatever.
I know.
Whatever you peoples want.
Whatever. But our show notes are all on the retroblasting.com/Dreamland. Each show notes are there. There's sometimes we put pictures and links to references that we looked at and stuff like that. You can also download the episode or listen to it right from the internet if you'd like, or you can, of course, download it in your favorite podcast app. And you can email us at thedreamlandpodcast@gmail.com. And so there you go.
All right. Well, looking forward to the next time we get together. We're working on some things, so we may see you guys a little sooner than you expect.
Yeah, that'll be cool.
All right.
All right. See you guys later. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.
Bye.